Imagine just looking out at the sheer chaotic expanse of human history.
Oh, yeah, it is a mess.
Right. Like, if you just take a step back and look at the timeline of our species, what do you actually see?
Well, mostly wars over resources, right?
Exactly. Wars, vast inequality, these artificial borders just drawn in the dirt, and this perpetual grinding friction between the people who have things and the people who just don't.
Yeah, and the crazy part is we have this tendency to look at that historical mess, shrug, and just assume it's the natural order of things.
We really do. Like, humanity is just this massive box of puzzle pieces that was dropped on the floor a few thousand years ago, and we're all just blindly hoping those pieces somehow bump into each other and form a coherent, peaceful picture.
It's the default human assumption, isn't it? We look at the fragmentation of our societies and we completely normalize it.
Yeah, we tell ourselves, oh, societal progress is just this agonizingly slow process.
Right, like maybe 2 steps forward and then inevitably 3 steps sideways.
Yeah.
With a whole lot of stumbling in the dark along the way. We basically assume conflict is baked right into our DNA.
But, what if it isn't? What if that baseline assumption is just completely wrong?
That is the big question today.
It is. Today, we are looking at a text that takes that historical chaos, looks it right in the eye, and totally challenges it with a biological metaphor. And it is so stunningly precise, it completely flips our understanding of human potential.
It really does. We are stepping into a conceptual framework that looks at human sociology and basically says, no, this shouldn't be chaotic.
Right. It says this should operate with the absolute, unyielding, mathematically perfect precision of a beehive.
It is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. I mean, to look at the messy, ego-driven, fragmented human being and map a path toward the instinctual perfection of the bee, that is a monumental intellectual journey.
And that is exactly the journey we are taking you on today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Now, before we jump into the deep end, I need to make a very clear, very important disclaimer about our role today.
Definitely necessary.
Yeah. Today, we are examining a specific religious, historical, and philosophical text. Specifically, we are diving into Allama Parwez's lecture on the Quran, which serves as the grand finale lecture 15 of 15 in the Tolu Islam Digital Archive.
Right, and our job here is to act purely as impartial guides.
Exactly. We are here to unpack the profound sociological, economic, and linguistic arguments presented in the source material. We are not here to endorse any religious viewpoints as absolute truth.
And we are absolutely not taking any political sides.
Zero. Whether you are listening to this from a political left, the conservative right, or somewhere completely outside of modern political spectrums, our mission is simply to report on the mechanics of the text.
We are essentially holding up a blueprint and showing you how this specific framework views the architecture of a perfect society.
And, architecture is the perfect word for it, because what this lecture does so brilliantly is that it treats sociology and theology not as these vague, mystical, cloudy concepts that you just have to take on blind faith.
Right, it treats them as tangible, observable laws of nature. It argues that a healthy society operates on laws just as real and unbreakable as gravity.
So here is where we are starting. If you've been following the broader context of this material, we are wrapping up our look at the chapter of the bee, which is Surah An-Nahl in the text.
Yeah, and in the earlier portions of this chapter, the text spends a lot of time examining the literal biological mechanics of a bee.
It does. It looks at the flawless way a bee interacts with its environment, how it gathers resources and contributes to the hive. But now, at the very end of the chapter, the text executes this massive, breathtaking pivot.
It really is a massive shift. It moves completely from the insect world to the human world.
Right. It introduces us to a human being who was so incredibly logical, so fearfully upright, and so perfectly aligned with those natural laws that the original text refers to him as a one-man nation.
Which is such a powerful phrase. We're talking about the historical figure of Ibrahim, or Abraham.
Yeah. And transitioning from a tiny, buzzing insect to one of the most towering historical prophets in human history is, well, quite the leap.
It is, but the lecture builds a fascinating bridge between the two. And it builds that bridge using a topic that most people would never expect to find at the core of an ancient religious text.
Which is?
Macroeconomics.
I have to admit, when I first read through the source material for this, that stopped me in my tracks.
I had the exact same reaction.
Because when we think of ancient texts, we are totally conditioned to expect discussions about the ethereal. We expect rituals, chanting, deep dives into the afterlife, or debates about unseen realms.
Right. But this lecture pulls the camera right down into the dirt. It looks at the absolute bedrock of human suffering.
Yes. And it identifies the core disease of our species as a fundamental conflict over economics and ownership. Allama Parwez points out in this lecture that almost every worldly conflict, like the very engine of our societal friction, stems from one specific human invention.
The concept of absolute personal property.
Exactly. Absolute personal property.
It is a profound critique of how we have structured human civilization from the ground up. The lecture highlights these classic enduring tensions.
Like the capitalist versus the laborer.
Yes, or the wealthy landowner versus the peasant farmer. It asks us to look at a scenario that has played out for millennia. A farmer works a piece of land for an entire year.
Right. They wake up before dawn, they till the soil, they plant the seeds.
They sweat, they harvest, they put in all the physical and temporal equity. But then the landowner, who perhaps lives hundreds of miles away and hasn't lifted a single finger to help with the harvest, swoops in and takes half or sometimes more of the yield.
And why? Simply because they hold a legal deed, an invisible human-made concept of ownership.
Exactly. And the lecture is essentially asking, by what natural law does that make any sense?
Human beings have created a system where we claim ultimate, infinite ownership over resources we had absolutely zero hand in creating.
Right. I didn't invent the carbon in the soil.
I didn't engineer the hydrological cycle that brings the rain. I didn't design the underlying quantum physics of photosynthesis that makes the seed grow.
Yet, humanity's default setting is to draw an arbitrary, invisible line in the dirt, point to it and say, this is mine.
It is infinitely mine, and I have the right to withhold it from you, even if you are starving.
That hoarding mentality right there. The text argues that this specific assumption is the core biological sickness of human society.
So what is the text's proposed solution? Because it obviously has one.
It does. It offers a massive, sweeping paradigm shift. It argues that true, absolute ownership belongs exclusively to the divine.
But we have to be careful with that word, right?
Definitely. Because in the context of this specific philosophical framework, the divine is intimately equated with the overarching, unchangeable system of nature.
The overarching laws of the universe.
Exactly.
Let me try to put a modern, real-world analogy on this to make sure we are grasping the scale of what this text is proposing. Let's imagine a massive, state-of-the-art global factory.
Yeah, I like this.
The factory owner, which in this metaphor represents the creator or the system of nature, has provided the entire building. They provided the heavy machinery, they routed the electricity, they sourced all the raw materials, and they ensure the ventilation system keeps everyone breathing.
Right, they built the whole infrastructure.
Yeah, and the workers inside the factory represent humanity. Their sole contribution is their labor, their physical and mental effort to operate the machines.
So what is the source text arguing here?
It's essentially arguing that the factory, meaning the earth and all its natural resources, belongs entirely to the owner. Therefore, the output of that factory should be distributed among the workers based on their actual needs and the effort they put in.
Which completely bypasses the concept of human feudalism.
Totally. It says that no single worker on the factory floor has the right to suddenly draw a circle around 3 of the most productive machines, claim he owns them, and start charging the other workers a tax to use them.
That is a perfect distillation of the text's economic argument. The system of nature provides the capital, and human beings provide the labor.
Right, and the idea that one human laborer gets to permanently monopolize the natural capital to the detriment of the rest of the species is a direct violation of natural law.
And this is exactly where the text brings us right back to the metaphor of the bee.
Oh man, the bee. Because the bee is the ultimate living embodiment of this natural economic model.
It really is. The text specifically points out the staggering labor required to produce honey.
Yeah, the source material specifically notes a single worker bee will fly incredible distances up to 19,000 miles.
19,000 miles. Think about that.
Just making countless trips just to gather enough nectar to create a tiny spoon of honey. In the insect world, that honey is an incredibly valuable, energy-dense commodity. It is high-value output.
But here's the kicker. That worker bee, after flying 19,000 miles, does not return to the hive and claim absolute personal property over that honey.
It doesn't act like a human capitalist.
Not at all. It doesn't set up a tiny toll booth at the entrance of the hive.
Right?
It doesn't take its spoon of honey, lock it in a private vault, and then charge the younger bees an interest rate. to access it during the winter.
It doesn't leverage its surplus to gain political power over the queen either.
Exactly. It flies back into the hive. It deposits the honey into the communal comb for the collective need of the entire society. It takes only the precise amount of energy it needs to sustain its own biological functions, and then it quietly turns around and goes right back to work.
The text is making a profound observation here. The bee simply does not possess the cognitive concept of absolute private ownership.
It understands contribution, it understands survival, but the surplus always belongs to the system.
But wait, hang on. This is where I have to push back, and I think this is the exact objection anyone listening right now is going to have, especially if you're commuting to a corporate job or stressing over a mortgage.
Sure, lay on me.
A bee is an insect. It is biologically hardwired to do that. It literally does not have the neural architecture to make a choice.
That's entirely true.
Right. It doesn't have an ego. It doesn't have a fear of missing out. It doesn't have anxiety about its retirement fund. And it doesn't have ambition to be better than the bee next to it. Human beings have free will.
We're deeply complex, fearful, ambitious creatures.
Exactly. So how can a text seriously map insect biology onto complex human macroeconomics without the whole theory just falling apart upon contact with human nature? Like, how do you overwrite the messy human operating system to act with that kind of flawless collective logic?
Well, that pushback is entirely justified.
Yeah.
And honestly, it is the exact tension that drives the rest of the lecture.
Oh, really? So it acknowledges that.
Absolutely. The text doesn't naively pretend that humans are identical to bees. It acknowledges that human free will introduces chaos.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. To achieve the bees' level of societal balance voluntarily, to choose collective well-being over individual hoarding when you actually have the power to hoard, requires a psychological state that is exceptionally rare.
It requires an incredibly disciplined mind, then.
A completely unfragmented mind. And because that is so difficult to conceptualize in the abstract, the text pivots away from the bee and introduces us to a historical case study of a human being who actually achieved it.
The Ibrahimic model.
The Ibrahimic model.
Okay, let's dive deep into this. The text examines verse 16.120 of the Quran, which gives the prophet Ibrahim a title that honestly made me do a double take when I was reading the source material.
It's a very striking title.
It explicitly describes him as an ummah. Now, for anyone familiar with the linguistics here, ummah is a massive, heavy word.
It translates to an entire nation, a vast community, a civilization.
Right. But the text is applying this sweeping plural noun to one single guy.
Yes, a one-man nation. Just think about the sociological weight of that concept.
It's staggering.
It is. The lecture deliberately asks the reader to pause and wonder, why is a solitary individual being awarded the title of an entire population?
And the answer the text provides is just wild. It asserts that Ibrahim possessed the incredibly diverse capabilities, the profound psychological resilience, and the monumental, earth-shattering historical impact that you would typically only find distributed across millions of people.
It's saying he wasn't just a specialist. He wasn't just a really good philosopher or just a charismatic politician.
Right, because if you look at a functioning nation, you have a distribution of labor. You have architects who build, philosophers who think, generals who strategize.
You have economists who manage resources, and rebels who push boundaries. The text argues that Ibrahim contained all of those vast, diverse capacities synthesized within a single, unified personality.
So when he moved, it was as if an entire civilization was shifting its weight.
Precisely. And the lecture goes to great lengths to highlight what it actually took to be that one-man nation. It wasn't about him sitting quietly in a monastery, meditating on a mountaintop, and ignoring the world.
Oh, definitely not. The Ibrahimic model, according to this text, is rooted in systemic structural rebellion.
The lecture points out that Ibrahim didn't just casually disagree with the popular opinions of his era. He actively, aggressively challenged the highest, most dangerous, and most entrenched authorities of his time.
He went after the sovereign kings, the wealthy elite who controlled the resources, the powerful religious establishment.
And perhaps most agonizingly, from a psychological standpoint, his own father.
Let's talk about how he challenged them, because the text brings up the famous story of Ibrahim shattering the idols in the temple.
Yes, a very famous narrative.
Now, if you grew up hearing this story, it's usually presented almost like a children's fable. A guy walks into a room with an axe and smashes some statues made of wood and stone because people shouldn't pray to rocks.
Right, it's presented as a very basic theological argument against literal statues.
But the analysis in Allama Parwez's lecture goes so much deeper into the sociology of what those statues actually represented.
This is a crucial distinction. The lecture argues that these idols weren't just decorative religious art, they were deeply symbolic, functional tools of the state.
Functional tool.
Yes, they were the physical, localized representations of oppressive, societal concepts and false centers of power.
Okay, we have to unpack the mechanism of that oppression. Because, how does a stone statue actually oppress a farmer?
Well, if we look at the historical context of these ancient Mesopotamian or Babylonian societies, the massive temples, the ziggurats, were essentially the central banks of the era.
Central banks, wow.
Yeah. The elites, the priests, and the kings used the concept of these idols to extract wealth from the working class. They would tell the peasant farmer, if you don't bring half your wheat harvest to the temple as a tithe to the sun god's statue, the sun god will curse your fields with drought and your children will starve.
So the idol was the enforcement mechanism for economic extortion.
Exactly. The fear of the idol kept the hoarding system in place.
So when Ibrahim walks into that temple and shatters those physical idols, he isn't just committing an act of religious vandalism.
Not at all. He is executing a highly calculated act of social engineering.
Right, by reducing those all-powerful gods to a pile of rubble and showing the terrified public that no lightning bolt came down from the sky to strike him dead.
He was publicly demystifying the power structure. He was proving that these untouchable systems of power, these elites who claimed a divine right to hoard all the wealth, were actually relying on fragile, hollow constructs made by human hands.
He was breaking the psychological chains that kept the economic extortion in place.
Exactly.
I really want you, the listener, to just pause for a second and put yourself in his shoes. Think about the agonizing psychological reality of that moment.
It's terrifying.
How profoundly isolating must that have been? To look at your entire civilization, from the king who holds the power of life and death, all the way down to your own father sitting across from you at the dinner table, and to look them all in the eye and say, the fundamental logic upon which you have built your entire reality is a lie.
To be the only person in the world who sees the Matrix.
Yeah, exactly.
The internal fortitude required for that is almost beyond human comprehension, to completely resist the gaslighting of an entire society.
Think about modern peer pressure.
Right. It is hard enough for a person today to stand up against a popular opinion in a small meeting at work or on a social media thread without feeling a rush of anxiety.
And Ibrahim faced the threat of execution, exile, and the total loss of his family.
When the entire world is screaming at you that the sky is green and you are the solitary voice insisting it is blue, the mental toll, the sheer cognitive friction is enormous.
It is the ultimate historical example of being an outsider. But he wasn't just a rebel without a cause, tearing things down for the sake of anarchy.
No, he was a one-man wrecking ball to the sociological foundation of a corrupt society, yes. But after you shatter the old system, you are immediately faced with a new problem.
Right, you can't just tear down a corrupt economy and leave people with nothing.
You have to build a viable, superior alternative. You have to actually construct the beehive.
Which brings us perfectly into the next major phase of the Ibrahimic model as laid out in the lecture. The establishment of the foundations of a new system.
And in the terminology of the text, this system is referred to as establishing Salat.
So the text details the narrative of Ibrahim leaving those fertile, established, but utterly corrupt civilizations. He travels into the desert and establishes a new center for humanity at the Kaaba in Mecca.
And the lecture makes a very deliberate point of highlighting the geography of this decision.
Geography is huge here.
He places his family in a completely barren, uncultivable, hostile valley. There are no rivers, there is no arable soil, there are no natural resources to mine.
It is a terrifying blank slate.
It is. And paying attention to that geographical detail is absolutely vital for understanding the economic argument the lecture is making.
The text zeroes in on the famous prayer Ibrahim makes when he leaves his family in this barren wasteland. But Allama Parwez draws our focus to the very specific order of the requests within that prayer.
This part is fascinating.
It blew my mind, because what does a prophet, the founder of a massive religious movement, pray for when he establishes the literal epicenter of his faith?
You would think the very first thing he asks for is spiritual enlightenment.
Right, you'd think he'd pray, make my descendants great mystics, or grant them deep philosophical insight, or give them visions of the angels.
But he doesn't.
No. His very first request is for material sustenance. He explicitly prays for fruits and economic resources to be brought to this barren valley.
If we look at this through the lens of modern psychology, Allama Parwez is pointing out that this ancient text delivered a masterclass in Maslow's hierarchy of needs centuries before Abraham Maslow was even born.
Yes, exactly.
The text is asking a logical question. Why does a visionary prophet tasked with establishing a divine system of societal balance prioritize basic economics?
And the lecture argues forcefully that you simply cannot establish a divine system which it defines as salat, an active, functional system of societal balance, justice, and mutual support, if the population's foundational economic needs are not securely met.
If you're listening to this and you've ever struggled to make rent, or you've ever been terrified of losing your job and not being able to feed your kids, you know exactly how this feels.
You cannot expect a human being or an entire society to be truly thankful, to be generous, or to sit around debating high-minded moral philosophy if they are in a constant state of panic about starving to death.
Fear of scarcity breeds selfishness. It forces humans to abandon the collective beehive mentality and revert to ruthless hoarding just to survive.
Precisely. The lecture is launching a vehement, aggressive argument against the romanticized, often mystical idea that true religion or deep philosophy is about detaching from the physical world, starving yourself in a cave, and ignoring the economy.
It argues the exact opposite. True systemic change, true spiritual elevation, and societal morality require economic stability as a non-negotiable baseline.
A starving society cannot focus on higher-level progress. Its entire cognitive bandwidth is consumed by basic survival.
And survival mode inevitably leads to violence, theft, and the breakdown of any mutual support system.
So how did this new society's mechanics actually work compared to the hoarding societies he left behind?
Well, in Babylon, if a farmer grew 100 apples, the king took 50 under the threat of a cursed idol, and the farmer hid the rest so his neighbor wouldn't steal them.
Right. But the text argues that the system of Salat Ibrahim established in Mecca was designed to operate like the hive. The community works together, and the surplus is structurally returned to the community to care for the vulnerable.
The text says he prayed for them to have material sustenance so that they might be thankful.
In this specific socioeconomic context, thankfulness isn't just saying a polite thank you to the sky after a meal.
No, thankfulness is a sociological state of being. It is the ability to operate within a cooperative system, sharing resources without the crippling panic of scarcity constantly whispering in your ear to hoard.
But to build that kind of balanced society, to go from a blank, terrifying slate in a barren valley to a thriving, cooperative socioeconomic system, the architect needs an incredibly focused mindset.
A mind that absolutely refuses to get distracted by fear, by superficial desires, or by the temptation to just become a new king and hoard the wealth for himself.
Which brings us to what I genuinely think is the absolute gem of this entire deep dive. This is where we get into the linguistic breakdown.
Linguistic dive is phenomenal here.
To describe this unyielding, perfect mindset, the source text zooms in on two very specific ancient Arabic words used to describe Ibrahim's cognitive state. These two words are essentially the engine of his reason.
They are Qanit and Hanif.
The linguistic analysis in this section of the lecture is brilliant because it strips away centuries of vague theological translations.
If you read a standard English translation today, Qanit is usually just translated loosely as obedient or devout.
Right, which feels a bit flat.
It is flat, but Allama Parwez refuses to settle for that. He takes the listener all the way back to the ancient linguistic roots of the word, exploring exactly how the Bedouins utilized this specific term in the harsh reality of the desert.
I loved this explanation. It paints such a vivid, tactile picture of what the human mind is capable of.
In ancient classical Arabic, the word qanit and originally referred to a very specific physical object. It referred to a leather water skin or sometimes a camel's udder that is completely full.
But the nuance is key here, right? It is not just full.
Exactly. It is full to the absolute stretching brim, yet it is constructed and tied so perfectly that it does not leak a single solitary drop wastefully.
Think about the stakes of what a water skin means to a traveler in the middle of a blazing, barren desert. It is not just a convenience.
No, it is literal life and death. If that water skin has a tiny hole, if it leaks its contents into the sand while you are walking, you will die of dehydration before you reach the oasis.
Exactly. The Qanit and water skin is taut. It is holding maximum capacity. It is heavy with life-saving resources, but its valve is tight.
It only pours out its precious contents exactly when, where, and in the precise amount purposefully required by the traveler. It conserves its energy perfectly.
So, how do we map an ancient desert water skin onto the human mind? What does this mean for you and me right now?
That's the real application.
Think of the Qanit mindset as the difference between a cheap, scattered flashlight and a highly focused industrial laser.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. A standard flashlight diffuses its energy everywhere. You turn it on, and it throws light left, right, up, down. It illuminates a wide area, sure, but because its energy is scattered and leaking in 100 different directions, it loses its power very quickly. It can't penetrate deeply.
But a laser.
A laser, on the other hand, takes that exact same amount of energy, but it refuses to let it leak. It concentrates all of its light onto a single, microscopic, intense point. And because it doesn't diffuse, because it retains all of its focus, it can cut through solid sheets of steel.
That is a phenomenal analogy for what the text is conveying about Ibrahim. His mental, emotional, and intellectual energy didn't leak.
He didn't waste his cognitive load scrolling through the equivalent of ancient societal anxieties.
He didn't leak energy worrying about what the elites thought of him. He didn't drain his willpower on fragmented, contradictory desires or the fear of being an outcast.
His intellectual capacity was completely full to the brim, but it was entirely contained and ruthlessly directed toward his singular mission of systemic change.
And that concept of not being scattered ties directly, inextricably, into the second word the text analyzes, Hanifan.
Yes, Hanifan. What does that literally mean?
It fundamentally means turning away from all fragmented, divergent, or false paths in order to focus singularly on one unified logic or law.
The lecture points out that the Quran emphasizes Ibrahim was not a polytheist.
But Allama Parwez completely redefines what polytheism shirk actually means in this sociological context. He argues it wasn't just about the primitive act of believing in multiple literal gods residing in the sky.
Polytheism in this framework is the state of having a fractured, contradictory mind.
It describes a mind that is pulled in 100 different directions by competing ideologies and loyalties.
Let's modernize it, right? If you worship the god of extreme wealth accumulation on Monday, and then try to worship the god of humble societal equality on Tuesday, and then bow to the god of ruthless political power on Wednesday, your mind is severely fragmented.
Your internal logic is constantly warring with itself. Your water skin is leaking everywhere.
Hanifan means ruthlessly cutting away all of those competing, contradictory loyalties and aligning your entire being with a single, overarching principle of truth and natural law.
So when you combine these two concepts, you get a master blueprint for human potential. A Qanit and Hanif mindset belongs to someone whose intellectual and emotional energy is fully conserved, laser-focused, and directed solely at a unified logical truth, completely ignoring all the societal noise and fear trying to distract them.
It is honestly no wonder the text called him a one-man nation. If you have a mind operating at that level of unyielding focus, you have the capacity to move mountains.
Or, in Ibrahim's historical case, the capacity to shatter corrupt empires and lay the architectural foundation for entirely new civilizations.
But the true power of this lecture is that it refuses to leave this concept safely in the past as a nice piece of historical biography.
It brings it forcefully and uncomfortably into the present day by analyzing how we, right now, interact with these revolutionary ideas.
Which brings us to a fascinating part of our journey today, reclaiming revolutionary concepts.
The source text launches a heavy, incisive critique against how incredibly dynamic, world-changing ideas have been systematically watered down over the centuries until they become completely passive, static, harmless rituals.
It takes direct aim at the institutionalization of philosophy and religion. It uses the concept of Maqam-e-Ibrahim, which translates to the Station of Abraham, as its primary example.
Right. If you go to the physical city of Mecca today, there is a literal, tangible enclosure near the Kaaba that is called the Maqam-e-Ibrahim.
In common practice, it's often treated simply as a specific geographical spot, a blessed piece of stone where the historical figure allegedly stood while building the structure. People go there to physically stand in the same spot and recite prayers.
And Allama Parwez's lecture argues that treating it merely as a physical footprint or a historical prayer mat completely neuters the actual power of the concept.
According to the deep linguistic and contextual analysis in the text, the Station of Abraham is not a physical place on a map. It is a status. It is a lifestyle.
It is an active, breathing, dangerous commitment to struggle against oppression exactly as Ibrahim did.
To truly occupy the station of Abraham doesn't mean buying a plane ticket and standing on a piece of marble. It means you are willing to stand up to the modern kings.
The modern corrupt elites, the modern flawed economic systems that hoard resources while people starve.
It means you are willing to be the isolated one-man nation when everyone else in your office or your city or your country is passively conforming to a broken system.
And this raises a profound sociological point about how human institutions function. Institutions, by their very nature, prioritize stability and self-preservation. They absolutely despise disruption.
So what happens when a massive, entrenched institution inherits a text about a radical disruptor like Ibrahim? How do they handle the legacy of a man whose entire claim to fame is smashing the established order?
They neutralize him. They meticulously transform his dynamic, revolutionary call to action into a safe, passive ritual.
Instead of telling the public, go out into your communities and aggressively challenge the corrupt economic systems that are crushing the poor, the institution says, come here, stand on this specific square foot of marble, recite these specific words, and you have fulfilled your duty.
It gives the individual the psychological illusion that they are following in the footsteps of a great prophet, without requiring him to take on any of the actual systemic real-world risk.
That is such a sharp, devastating critique of human nature. And the text applies that exact same critical lens to another massive concept, Qiyamah, or resurrection.
Yes, the lecture notes that words like Qiyamah have been almost entirely relegated to the realm of the afterlife in the popular imagination.
People think of it exclusively in the eschatological sense, the literal end of the world, the final judgment day, an event shrouded in magic and mysticism that happens after you die.
But the text pulls it back to its linguistic roots. In ancient Arabic, it meant something far more immediate. It meant massive, earth-shaking social revolutions happening in the present world.
Exactly. The literal root of the word means to stand up or to rise.
In the sociological context of the Quran, the lecture argues it often refers to the awakening of dead nations. Imagine a population that has been mercilessly crushed by tyranny for generations.
They have been stripped of their human rights, their resources have been stolen, and they have been reduced to the mental state of mere survival, acting more like exhausted beasts of burden than humans.
They are, sociologically speaking, a dead nation. When that population finally wakes up, when they organize, when they find their Hanif in focus and literally stand up against their oppressors to reclaim their humanity, that event is a Qiyamah.
That is the true resurrection of a dead society.
But again, think about how institutions handle that. If you convince the oppressed masses that resurrection is purely a magical event that only happens at the end of time, you completely remove the burden of responsibility from the present moment.
You can essentially tell the starving, oppressed people, don't worry about trying to overthrow the tyrant today. Just accept your suffering, be patient, and wait for the ultimate resurrection in the afterlife to sort it out.
It pacifies the revolution. The text we are examining today is aggressively, unapologetically reclaiming these terms as active, present-day sociological imperatives.
It is a loud, undeniable call to immediate action, but that realization naturally leads to a massive strategic problem.
The how?
Yeah. If the ultimate goal is a social revolution, if you want to trigger the awakening of a dead nation and replace a system of selfish hoarding with the beautiful collective logic of the beehive, how do you actually persuade real stubborn human beings to join that cause?
Right. If you can't just wave a magic wand, what is the method?
Well, you certainly don't do it by just yelling at people, which brings us to the methodology laid out in the text, the art of logical persuasion.
The deep dive shifts its focus to verse 125 of Surah An-Nahl. This specific verse acts as the strategic manual for persuasion.
The verse commands, invite to the way of your Rab with hikmah. Let's unpack hikmah. In most casual translations, this word is simply rendered as wisdom.
But as we've seen, Allama Parwez doesn't settle for vague terms. The text provides a remarkably specific, almost mechanical definition. It explicitly defines hikmah as the science of correct application.
The science of correct application. I absolutely love the weight of that phrase. It takes the concept of wisdom out of the realm of abstract, bearded philosophers sitting under trees and makes it sound like rigorous structural engineering.
Because, in the context of building a society, it is engineering. It is social engineering rooted entirely in reason, verifiable logic, and intellect.
The text is adamant on this point. You do not win people over, and you absolutely do not build a sustainable cooperative movement through shouting, through foaming at the mouth with anger, or through relying on esoteric, unverifiable mysticism.
The lecture goes surprisingly hard against the mystical, highly emotional approach to religion or societal change. It argues that if a deeply spiritual person comes to the public and claims to have had a profound internal vision, a magical dream, or some secret divine knowledge that was granted exclusively to them in the middle of the night, that claim is entirely, functionally useless for the betterment of society.
And why is it useless? Because it cannot be rationally verified by the collective mind.
Exactly. Think about it logically. If I come to you and say, I had a powerful mystical dream last night that told me we need to completely restructure the city's tax code and redistribute wealth, you have absolutely no way to engage with that argument.
It is a closed intellectual loop. I hold all the cards. The text argues that internal, unverifiable visions cannot be used as the foundation to cure the systemic diseases of the public because they don't operate on a shared platform of logic.
You cannot debate a vision. You cannot stress test a dream. You are left with only two terrible options. You either follow the visionary blindly, surrendering your own intellect, or you reject them entirely. And the Ibrahimic model, the text fiercely insists, fundamentally rejects blind following. A society of blind followers is just waiting for a new tyrant to take over.
Instead of mystical coercion, the text advocates for what it calls Mau'iza Hasana, which translates to goodly or beautiful exhortation.
But we need to clarify that beautiful, in this context, doesn't just mean speaking in flowery poetry. It means appealing to shared human values, appealing to human empathy and emotion, but doing so on a bedrock of flawless rationality.
You show them how the system benefits everyone, and then the text goes further. It says, if you inevitably encounter friction and you must debate the Arabic word used as jidal, that debate must be conducted in the absolute most excellent, respectful, and logically sound manner possible.
You engage vigorously with the substance of their arguments, you point out the logical flaws in their economic or social theories, but you never attack the person's dignity.
And what happens if, after all that perfect logic, they still look you in the eye and reject your argument?
You walk away. You leave them be.
Just walk away.
Yeah, the text explicitly reminds the reformer that you are not a fojdar, a term meaning you are not a police officer, a warden, or an armed enforcer. You do not try to force the ideology down their throats at sword point or gunpoint.
I really want to apply this to the modern world because it is so incredibly relevant. Think about our digital landscape for just a second.
Oh, it's the exact opposite.
It is. If you look at the architecture of the modern internet, our social media algorithms, our modern political discourse on television, it is all built on the exact diametric opposite of what this text is preaching.
The modern digital world is engineered to run on outrage, shouting matches, zero-sum debates, where the goal is to humiliate your opponent.
Dunking on people for likes, and pure, unfiltered emotional manipulation.
It is a landscape explicitly designed to fragment the human mind. It is the absolute antithesis of the Hanif and laser focus. It rewards the leaking water skin.
Yes, we are financially incentivized by algorithms to leak our mental energy constantly, getting angry at 100 different micro-controversies every single day.
But this text, written centuries ago, is arguing that the moment you lose your temper, the moment you rely on raw anger instead of the science of correct application, you have already definitively lost the argument.
You might win the shouting match. You might get the most retweets. You might humiliate your opponent into silence. But you will never, ever change the underlying paradigm.
You will never build the cooperative beehive using the tools of outrage.
Because lasting systemic change, the kind of change that turns a barren valley into a thriving civilization, cannot be built on a foundation of coerced compliance or emotional exhaustion.
It must be built on a foundation of shared, deeply understood logic. If the people don't logically buy into the cooperative system, if they only share their resources because they are afraid of the enforcer yelling at them, then the exact moment the enforcer leaves the room, the system collapses.
The people will immediately revert to their default programming of hoarding and conflict.
So we have this beautifully articulated, highly logical method of persuasion. We have the blueprint. But let's be fiercely realistic for a moment.
Yeah, let's talk about the real world.
If you actually go out into the real world and try to fundamentally change a society, if you start challenging the wealthy elites, the corporations, the entrenched political status quo, even if you do it with perfect logic, perfect manners, and the science of correct application, you are going to face massive, terrifying opposition.
People in positions of immense power do not simply hand over the keys to the castle just because you presented them with a really well-structured, logical argument about a beehive.
They will fight back, often brutally.
Which is exactly the grim reality that the closing verses of Surah 16 address. And it brings us to the final major concept of our deep dive social physics and the Musinin.
The text offers advice to the reformer on how to handle that inevitable, often violent opposition. It tells the reader to remain steadfast, to hold their ground, and crucially, to not let their heart become constricted by the plots and the machinations of their opponents.
It's essentially saying, don't let the anxiety of the pushback eat you alive.
And it doesn't just offer an empty platitude to make them feel better. It bases this reassurance on a fundamental law of the universe. It relies on a rule of what the lecture essentially describes as social physics.
The closing verse states unequivocally, God is with those who are mutakin and musinin.
Okay, we need to spend some real time breaking down these two terms, mutakin and musinin. Because just like everything else in this lecture, Allama Parwez completely strips away the standard, passive, ritualistic definitions.
Let's start with mutakin. In a lot of casual contexts, this is translated as those who fear God or the pious. But what does it mean in the framework of social physics?
In the context of this lecture's rigorous framework, mutakin refers to those who are highly aware of the laws of nature and meticulously guard themselves against the destructive consequences of violating those laws.
Think of it like structural engineering. If you are building a skyscraper, gravity is a law of nature. A mutakin builder is one who respects gravity, calculates the load-bearing capacity perfectly, and guards the structure against collapse.
In sociology, it means guarding your society against the decay of hoarding, injustice, and corruption, because you know those actions will inevitably lead to societal collapse. It is about maintaining the baseline structural integrity of a healthy society.
And then it pairs that baseline defense with the offense, the musinin. Often, musinin is translated simply and mildly as the doers of good.
It makes you think of someone who occasionally gives a few coins to charity or smiles at their neighbor.
But through the lens of this lecture, it means something fiercely active.
It does. It means that the overarching forces of nature, the arc of social progress, the very evolutionary drive of the universe itself, only align with those who are actively and tangibly improving the system.
Active improvement, not passive existence.
Exactly. The lecture argues that God, or the overarching system of natural success, does not align with those who simply sit in circles, performing passive, repetitive rituals, waiting for the world to fix itself.
If you see a broken economic system and your only response is to sit in your room and pray for it to get better while taking absolutely no logical, systemic, real-world steps to improve it, you are not among the musinin.
True alignment with the universe requires adding value. It requires creating beauty, creating equitable balance, and doing the hard, messy, practical work of tangible betterment in society.
It is the difference between looking at a person with a shattered leg and just hoping really hard that their bone miraculously heals versus actually being the doctor who steps in, realigns the bone, puts a cast on it, and walks them through 6 months of painful physical therapy.
The universe, according to this text, favors the one who does the physical therapy.
I find that concept incredibly radically empowering because it shifts the burden of progress entirely onto our shoulders. You aren't sitting around waiting for a magical intervention to fix inflation or cure societal diseases or stop wars.
You are taking active, reasoned, systemic responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
You are becoming the musinin. You are becoming the architect of the beehive.
It completely removes the comforting excuse of passivity. If the Ibrahimic model of the one-man nation is the ultimate goal, and the science of correct application hikmah is the methodology, then becoming a musinin, an active, relentless improver of the world around you, is the daily execution of that goal.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an absolutely immense, sweeping amount of ground today. We have traveled from biology to ancient history to modern psychology. Let's briefly synthesize this massive journey before we wrap up our time together.
We began by looking at the biological perfection of the literal bee, an insect operating flawlessly on natural instinct, contributing its maximum effort to the collective hive without ever succumbing to the human disease of claiming absolute personal property over the surplus.
And then we transition to the ultimate human challenge. How do we, burdened with our messy free will, our egos, and our fear of scarcity, ever achieve that kind of beautiful balance?
The text presented us with the solution, the Ibrahimic model, the concept of the one-man nation. The blueprint for a mind that is Qanit, full to the absolute brim with intellectual energy, but never leaking a drop wastefully.
And Hanif laser-focused on a single, unfragmented logic, refusing to be torn apart by the competing idols of society.
We saw how adopting that model demands an active, highly visible rebellion against oppressive systems. It demands recognizing that you must establish economic stability, material sustenance, as the absolute non-negotiable foundation for any higher spiritual or societal progress.
And it demands a fierce refusal to let dynamic, revolutionary concepts, like standing up against tyranny, be watered down by institutions into safe, static rituals.
And finally, we looked at the real-world execution. The art of logical persuasion, the realization that you cannot build a better world with outrage or unverifiable mysticism.
You have to use the science of correct application, reject the noise, and become an active improver of the system, the Musinin, in order to align yourself with the very forces of nature.
It is a remarkably cohesive, brilliantly structured sociological manual hidden within the verses of an ancient text.
It really is. It changes how you view history, and more importantly, how you view your own potential.
And as we finally close out this specific chapter, I am required to read this closing statement exactly as it is written to fulfill our mission for the archive today. We have completed the 15-lecture journey through Surah 16. From the flight of the bee to the social contract, we've seen that the Quran is a manual for a pure life. Ayat and Tayyiba. Next, we move to Surah 17, where the Isra, the journey, takes us into the depth of human history and the 17-lecture breakdown of civilizational rise and fall.
And as you, the listener, step away from this deep dive and back into your own life, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder. Think deeply about that concept of Qanit, the water skin that never leaks.
In our modern era, our attention is constantly, aggressively, and systematically fragmented by endless feeds, breaking news, push notifications, and manufactured outrage. The modern world is designed to puncture your water skin.
So ask yourself, where is your intellectual and emotional energy leaking right now? What arguments, what anxieties, what digital idols are draining your focus?
And what would happen if you finally gathered all that scattered, diffused energy, patched the leaks, and became a laser-focused one-person nation for a cause you truly believe in?
What actually happens when you decide to stop being a scattered flashlight and choose to become a laser? It's a profound question to carry with you.
Think back to our opening metaphor about dropping a box of puzzle pieces on the floor and just hoping they form a picture. The deep dive we explore today argues that the picture of a perfect society doesn't assemble itself by magic, and it certainly doesn't assemble if we are constantly distracted and leaking our potential.
It requires the focused, unyielding, unapologetic logic of the builder. It requires the mind of the architect.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.